Millionaire marries an ugly wife for a bet, but what he finds on wedding night changes everything. The ballroom of the Beaumont estate shimmered under the glow of 1,000 golden lights. A sea of opulence spread before Ethan Campbell. Men in tailored tuxedos laughed too loudly, their glasses of champagne glinting like liquid gold. Women in silk gowns exchanged polite insults, their diamonds catching the light as they gestured with rehearsed elegance. Ethan leaned against the marble bar, a tumbler of scotch in hand. His sharp suit, custom-made in Milan, fit him like a second skin, but he wore it with the casual indifference of someone accustomed to excess. He was bored, a persistent kind of boredom that clung to him like a shadow. "Ethan!" A voice broke through the hum of the room. Lucas Thorne, his best friend since their college days, slid onto the bar stool beside him. Lucas was grinning, his eyes already glazed from one too many martinis. "Tell me, Campbell," Lucas began, his voice carrying the arrogance of privilege, "how does it feel to have everything? The money, the cars, the women. Surely there's something that gets your blood pumping." Ethan smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Not much these days, Thorne. The thrill fades when you can buy the world." Lucas laughed, a sharp, cynical sound. "You've become predictable, my friend. Too safe, too boring." His eyes glittered with mischief as he leaned closer. "How about a little challenge?" Ethan arched an eyebrow, intrigued but wary. "What kind of challenge?" Lucas's grin widened. "The kind that reminds you what it feels like to take a risk. I'll bet you $5 million that you won't marry the first unattractive woman you see on the street." The words hung in the air, a careless taunt wrapped in privilege and cruelty. Ethan stared at Lucas, the audacity of the proposition stirring something dormant in him. A murmur of dissent echoed in the back of his mind, but he ignored it. The room felt smaller, the noise of laughter and clinking glasses fading into the background. "5 million," Ethan repeated, his voice low and incredulous. Lucas nodded, leaning back with the air of a man who knew he was untouchable. "5 million? You're always saying you can do anything. Prove it." Ethan's jaw tightened. The challenge was absurd, childish even, but something about it struck a chord. Was it the thrill of the gamble, the chance to shatter his own monotony, or was it his ego, pricked by Lucas's insinuation that he'd grown soft? "Fine," Ethan said, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. He downed the rest of his scotch and set the glass on the bar with a decisive clink. "You've got yourself a deal." Lucas clapped his hands together, laughing as if the outcome were already a foregone conclusion. "I knew you wouldn't back down. Let's take a walk, shall we?" The two men exited the ballroom, stepping into the cool night air. The city sprawled before them, alive with the hum of car engines and the chatter of pedestrians. Lucas gestured toward the street with a sweeping motion, as if presenting Ethan with a stage for his latest act of recklessness. And then Ethan saw her. She sat on a bench beneath a flickering street lamp, her hunched figure almost disappearing into the shadows. Her clothes were tattered, a mismatched collection of layers that barely seemed to ward off the chill. A faded knit hat covered her hair, and her face, half hidden behind a curtain of unkempt strands, was smeared with grime. At her feet lay a battered guitar case, its open lid holding a few crumpled bills and scattered coins. Ethan hesitated. Something about the scene gave him pause. She wasn't begging. She wasn't even looking at passers-by. Instead, she strummed her guitar with a quiet focus, her voice soft and haunting as she sang a melody that didn't belong on these streets. Lucas nudged him, a triumphant grin on his face. "There's your bride, Campbell, unless, of course, you're getting cold feet." Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to walk away, to call the whole thing off, but pride was a powerful motivator, and the weight of Lucas's mocking gaze was impossible to ignore. Squaring his shoulders, Ethan approached the bench, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The woman didn't look up as he stopped in front of her, her fingers still moving across the guitar strings. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice louder than he intended. She glanced up then, her eyes sharp and guarded. They were a startling shade of green, vibrant against the dirt, smudging her face. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone clipped. Ethan hesitated, the absurdity of his plan crashing down on him, but he pushed forward, driven by some mix of bravado and self-loathing. "I want to marry you." The woman blinked, her expression unreadable. Then she laughed, a dry, bitter sound that echoed in the stillness. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'll pay you, whatever you need." Her laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a glare that could cut glass. "You think I'm for sale?" Ethan felt his face flush, embarrassment blooming in his chest. "That's not what I meant. Look, "Save it," she interrupted, standing and slinging the guitar over her shoulder. She was taller than he expected, her posture defiant despite the obvious hardship she carried. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm not interested." She started to walk away, but Ethan reached out, his desperation surprising even himself. "Wait. Please, hear me out." She stopped but didn't turn around. Ethan took a breath, his mind racing for the right words. "My offer's serious. I'll help you. Whatever you need, money, shelter, medical bills, you'll have it. Just say yes." Finally, she turned to face him, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. "All right," she said, her voice heavy with resignation. "But you'd better keep your word." Ethan nodded, relief and unease swirling in his chest. He knew he had crossed a line, but there was no turning back now. As they walked away from the bench, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a deal with fate itself. The walk to Ethan's car felt like an eternity. The city buzzed around them, taxis honking, faint snippets of laughter spilling from nearby bars, and the occasional rustle of leaves carried by a cool breeze. Yet for Ethan, the world had narrowed to the figure walking a few paces behind him. Her name, offered reluctantly during their stilted introductions, felt weighty now. She walked with a cautious rigidity, as if she feared he might change his mind at any moment. The streetlights flickered as they passed, casting fleeting shadows on her face. For a moment, Ethan caught her profile, the sharp cheekbones, the defiant tilt of her chin, and felt an uncomfortable pang of recognition. This wasn't a woman accustomed to pity. The silence stretched between them until it felt unbearable. Ethan cleared his throat, fumbling for words. "So, Mia, do you play the guitar often?" Her laugh was a short, bitter sound. "Every day. Not much else to do when you're invisible." Ethan winced. He wasn't sure if her comment was meant to sting, but it did. "Invisible? I don't think that's true." She stopped abruptly, forcing him to turn. Her green eyes, illuminated by the pale glow of a street lamp, burned with frustration. "Really? Then what am I to you, a charity case? A joke?" She crossed her arms, her voice sharpening. "Don't stand there and pretend you saw me for anything other than what I looked like on that bench. You needed something, and I was convenient." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but closed it just as quickly. He didn't have a defense, and she knew it. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt small, stripped of the armor his wealth usually provided. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the hum of the city. Mia's gaze didn't waver. She studied him, her expression unreadable, before letting out a long breath. "Don't apologize if you don't mean it. Just, let's get this over with." The vulnerability in her voice struck him harder than her accusations. Ethan nodded, motioning toward the sleek black sedan parked at the curb. Inside the car, the tension was palpable. The leather seats gleamed under the dim cabin lights, but the luxury seemed almost grotesque in contrast to Mia's worn clothes. She ran her fingers over the stitching absent-mindedly, her expression distant. Ethan hesitated before starting the engine. "Where are you staying?" he asked, realizing too late how intrusive the question sounded. Mia smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Here and there. Park benches, shelters when there's space." "Why? Planning to tuck me in?" Ethan flushed, gripping the steering wheel. "No, I just thought you might want somewhere more comfortable tonight. She turned to him, her gaze steady. Comfortable isn't free, and I don't take handouts. It's not a handout, he replied quickly. It's part of the deal. Her eyebrows lifted, skepticism etched across her face. The deal, huh? And what exactly does this deal include, Mr. Campbell? Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his seat. He had expected this to be simpler, a transaction, no questions asked. But Mia wasn't making it easy, and a part of him respected her for it. You'll have a place to stay, he began carefully. Clothes, food, anything you need. In return, we play the part, publicly, just until the wedding. And after? She pressed, her voice sharp. Ethan hesitated. After, you're free to go. You'll have enough money to start over. No strings attached. Mia tilted her head, her green eyes narrowing. Just like that? Just like that, he affirmed, though he could feel her disbelief hanging heavy in the air. For a moment she said nothing. Then she turned away, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. Fine, she said finally, her voice flat, but don't expect me to smile for the cameras. The drive to Ethan's penthouse was a quiet one. He stole occasional glances at Mia, noting the way her fingers tapped a restless rhythm on her knee. Her defiance intrigued him, but it also unsettled him. She was nothing like the women he usually entertained, polished, poised, and eager to please. Mia was a storm, unpredictable and raw, and Ethan wasn't sure if he could weather it. When they arrived, the valet's eyes widened at the sight of Mia stepping out of the car. Ethan ignored the man's curious glance, ushering Mia inside quickly. The elevator ride to the top floor was suffocating. Mia leaned against the mirrored wall, her reflection a stark contrast to Ethan's immaculate appearance. She caught his gaze in the mirror and raised an eyebrow. What? Regretting your decision already? No, Ethan replied, though the word felt hollow. He wasn't sure what he felt, regret, curiosity, or something else entirely. When the elevator doors opened, Mia stepped out first, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the sprawling penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, and the open-plan space was adorned with modern art and minimalist furniture. Wow, she muttered, her tone laced with sarcasm. You really went all out on the whole rich bachelor aesthetic. Ethan frowned. It's just a place to live. Mia turned to him, her lips curving into a wry smile. Right, because this is what most people call living. He didn't have a response, and she didn't wait for one. Instead, she wandered toward the living room, her fingers brushing over the edge of a glass coffee table. For a moment, she looked small against the backdrop of luxury, a stark reminder of the worlds they came from. I'll show you to the guest room, Ethan said, his voice softer now. Mia followed him down the hallway, her footsteps hesitant. The room was pristine, with crisp white bedding and a view that rivaled the living rooms. Mia lingered in the doorway, her expression unreadable. This is yours, Ethan said, unsure why he felt the need to reassure her. For as long as you need. Mia stepped inside, her movements slow and deliberate. She ran her fingers along the edge of the bed before sitting down, her shoulders slumping slightly. Thanks, she said, the word barely more than a whisper. Ethan nodded, lingering for a moment before retreating to his own room. As he closed the door behind him, he exhaled deeply, the weight of the night pressing down on him. The morning came slowly, the first rays of sunlight painting the city skyline in shades of orange and gold. Ethan stood by the expansive window of his penthouse, sipping his coffee and staring at the world below. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the events of the night before in an endless loop. Mia Harper, her name lingered in his thoughts like an unfinished melody. She was a contradiction, a woman hardened by life yet unyielding in her sense of self. Ethan found himself wondering about her past, the story behind those sharp green eyes and the guarded expression she wore like armor. Mia stirred awake in the unfamiliar room, the morning light filtering through the sheer curtains. For a moment she was disoriented, her mind struggling to piece together where she was and how she had gotten there. Then it hit her, the deal, the penthouse, and the man who had brought her here. She sat up slowly, her fingers brushing against the soft fabric of the comforter. It was luxurious, far removed from the rough blankets at the shelters. The silence of the room was unnerving, a stark contrast to the constant noise of the streets she was used to. Mia swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. She hesitated for a moment before heading toward the adjoining bathroom. The sight of her reflection in the mirror stopped her in her tracks. The woman staring back at her looked every bit as tired as she felt. Her skin was pale, her eyes framed by dark circles. She touched her face lightly, tracing the lines that hardship had etched into her features. "Get it together, Mia," she muttered to herself, turning on the faucet and splashing cold water on her face. Ethan was already seated at the dining table when Mia emerged. The open-plan kitchen, with its sleek marble countertops and state-of-the-art appliances, looked more like something out of a magazine than a place where meals were actually prepared. "Good morning," Ethan greeted, his tone cautious. He had dressed casually in a grey sweater and dark jeans, a stark contrast to the polished image he projected at events. Mia hesitated before sitting down, her movements tentative. She glanced at the spread before her, freshly baked croissants, a bowl of vibrant fruit, and a carafe of orange juice. It was more food than she'd seen in weeks. "Do you always eat like this?" she asked, a hint of sarcasm in her voice. Ethan chuckled lightly, though the sound felt forced. "Not always. I had it prepared for you." Mia arched an eyebrow. "For me? Why?" He shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I thought you might want something decent for breakfast." Her eyes narrowed, but she reached for a croissant, tearing it apart slowly. The buttery aroma made her stomach growl, though she tried to eat with restraint. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing how desperate she really was. Ethan watched her in silence, his coffee cup cradled between his hands. There was something disarming about Mia's presence, something raw and unfiltered. She didn't mask her disdain for him, didn't try to impress him. It was refreshing and unsettling all at once. "So," Ethan began, his voice cutting through the quiet, "why the guitar?" Mia looked up, her expression wary. "What do you mean? You're obviously good at it. Is it just a hobby, or—" She set her croissant down and leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "It was never a hobby. It was a career once, or it was supposed to be." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What happened?" For a moment Mia seemed to weigh whether or not to answer. Finally she sighed, her gaze dropping to the table. "Life happened. Things fell apart. The kind of story people like you don't really care to hear." "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't care," Ethan said quietly. Mia's eyes snapped up to meet his, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, but she quickly masked it with a scoff. "Sure, because rich guys like you are just dying to understand what it's like to lose everything." Her words were a dagger, and Ethan felt the sting of them deeply. He could have argued, could have reminded her that she didn't know him any better than he knew her. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded, letting the moment pass. As the day wore on, Mia found herself wandering through the penthouse, her curiosity battling with her discomfort. The space was immaculate, every detail meticulously curated, yet it felt cold, more like a showroom than a home. In the corner of the living room, she spotted a grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon light. She approached it hesitantly, her fingers brushing against the keys. It had been years since she had played, but the feel of the ivory beneath her fingertips was achingly familiar. "Do you play?" Ethan's voice startled her, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. "I used to," she admitted, her voice soft. "Not anymore." He walked toward her, his expression unreadable. "Why not?" Mia shrugged, her hand falling away from the piano. "No point." Ethan frowned. "There's always a point. Music doesn't just disappear from your life because things get hard." Mia gave a bitter laugh. Easy for you to say. You've never had to choose between survival and passion. Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat down on the piano bench and gestured for her to join him. Mia hesitated, but something in his expression made her relent. She sat beside him, her posture stiff. "Play something," he urged gently. She shook her head. "I told you, I don't play anymore." "Just try," he said, his voice encouraging. "For yourself, not for me." Mia stared at the keys, her chest tightening. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hands on the keyboard. The first notes were hesitant, shaky, but as she played, something shifted. The melody grew stronger, filling the room with a haunting beauty that made Ethan's breath catch. When she finally stopped, the silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Mia's hands trembled as she pulled them away, and she refused to meet Ethan's gaze. "That was incredible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't matter," Mia replied, standing abruptly. "None of it matters." She left the room before he could respond, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. Ethan sat alone at the piano, the remnants of her music lingering in the air. For the first time he realized just how much he didn't understand and how much he wanted to. Mia stayed in the guest room for most of the morning. She had woken early, the sunlight filtering through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the pristine room. But no amount of luxury could shake the unease settling in her chest. The events of the past 2 days felt surreal. She was living in a penthouse she didn't belong in, eating food she didn't feel she deserved, and wearing clothes Ethan had left for her, a soft sweater and jeans that fit far too well, as though he'd carefully selected them. She hated the implication that he had thought about her needs, hated the feeling of being indebted to him. Still, the memory of the piano lingered. Her fingers had ached to play, even as her mind screamed at her to stop. She had walked away, but the music hadn't left her. It clung to her, a reminder of everything she had lost. When Mia finally emerged, she found Ethan in the living room, seated at the sleek black desk by the windows. He looked up when she entered, offering a tentative smile. "Good morning," he greeted. Mia crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Is this the part where you ask me how I slept and pretend we're playing house?" Ethan's smile faltered. "No, I was going to ask if you wanted breakfast." "I'm not hungry," she replied curtly. Ethan set his tablet aside, leaning back in his chair. "Look, I know this isn't exactly normal for either of us, but it doesn't have to be this difficult." Mia arched an eyebrow. "Difficult? You think this is difficult? Try sleeping on a bench in the middle of winter. Try watching your world fall apart while people like you step over you like you're invisible." Her words were a slap, sharp and unrelenting. Ethan stood, his hands resting on the desk as he met her glare. "You think I don't know what hardship is? You think I've never struggled?" Mia scoffed. "Struggled? Ethan, you live in a palace. You have everything handed to you on a silver platter. What could you possibly know about struggling?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me." Mia stepped forward, her voice rising. "And you don't know anything about me. You brought me here like some prize you won, like I'm part of some twisted game. You don't get to act like we're equals." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stared at her, his chest heaving. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth in her words left him speechless. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes, but that doesn't mean I don't want to understand." Mia blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. She searched his face for traces of mockery, but found none. "Why?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Why do you even care?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. He didn't have an answer, not one that made sense. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do." The tension between them remained thick, but something shifted in the air. Mia didn't respond, instead walking to the couch and sinking into the cushions. She leaned her head back, staring at the ceiling as if trying to find the words she couldn't say. Ethan watched her for a moment before retreating to the kitchen. He returned minutes later with a cup of tea, setting it on the coffee table in front of her. Mia glanced at it but didn't say anything. They sat in silence, the hum of the city below the only sound between them. Finally, Mia spoke. "The piano. It wasn't just a hobby. I thought it was my future, my way out." Ethan turned to her, his expression attentive. "What happened?" She took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the rim of the teacup. "There was an accident, a car crash. I lost my family, and my hands weren't the same after. I could still play, but not the way I used to. Everything fell apart after that." Her voice was steady, but the pain in her words was unmistakable. Ethan felt a pang of guilt for pushing her to play, for dredging up memories she had tried to bury. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Mia looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Don't be. It's not your fault." "But I made you." "You didn't make me do anything," she interrupted. "The music, it's still in me. I just don't know if I'll ever be able to face it again." Ethan nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "You should." Mia frowned. "Why do you care?" "Because I saw the way you played yesterday," he said, meeting her eyes. "You're not done with it, Mia. Not really." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stood, taking the teacup with her as she walked toward the window. The sunlight bathed her in a soft glow, highlighting the sharp angles of her face and the vulnerability etched into her features. Ethan watched her, his chest tightening with a feeling he couldn't quite name. She was a storm, fierce, untamed and beautiful in a way that defied explanation. And for the first time, he wondered if he was ready to face the chaos she would bring into his life. The evening descended over the city, casting long shadows across the penthouse. Ethan sat alone at the dining table, a half-empty glass of wine in front of him. The clinking of the ice against the glass punctuated the otherwise silent room. He hadn't seen Mia since their conversation earlier in the day. She had retreated to her room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He swirled the wine in his glass, his mind turning over her words. The accident, the loss, the pain she carried so quietly, so fiercely. Ethan had known hardship in his own way, long hours building his company, sleepless nights wondering if the gamble would pay off. But Mia's struggles were different. They weren't about ambition or risk. They were about survival, about the kind of resilience he could barely fathom. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had agreed to this bet for the thrill of it, for the novelty. But now, sitting in the quiet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd underestimated what he was getting himself into. Mia sat cross-legged on the floor of the guest room, the cup of tea Ethan had made her still resting on the nightstand. She hadn't touched it. Her gaze was fixed on the small, battered journal she had pulled from her bag. Its pages were filled with music, scribbled notes, half-finished compositions, and lyrics she hadn't sung in years. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, worn soft from years of handling. Music had been her life once. It had been the thread that tied her to her family, to her dreams, and then, in an instant, it was gone. She closed the journal with a heavy sigh, leaning her head back against the bed. The silence of the room pressed down on her, oppressive in its unfamiliarity. On the streets there was always noise, cars, voices, the hum of the city. Here, the quiet felt like a weight she couldn't escape. Her mind wandered to Ethan. She had seen the way he looked at her earlier, the mix of guilt and curiosity in his eyes. She didn't know what to make of him. He was arrogant, yes, but there was something else. A vulnerability he tried to hide behind his polished exterior. She hated that she noticed it, hated that it made her curious. Shaking her head, she stood and walked to the window. The city stretched out below her, a sea of lights against the dark sky. It felt like another world, one she didn't belong to. A soft knock at the door startled her. She turned, her heart pounding. "Come in," she said, her voice hesitant. Ethan stepped inside, his expression guarded. He held something in his hands, a small velvet box. "I thought you might want this," he said, holding it out to her. Mia frowned, taking the box reluctantly. She opened it to reveal a delicate bracelet, a simple silver chain with a tiny charm in the shape of a music note. Her breath caught in her throat. "I know it's not much," Ethan said quickly, his tone almost apologetic. "I just thought it might remind you of what you love." Mia stared at the bracelet, her fingers brushing over the charm. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and something about it stirred a deep ache in her chest. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Because I know what it's like to lose sight of what matters." She looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of insincerity. But all she saw was honesty, raw and unguarded. It unnerved her. "I don't need your pity," she said, though her tone lacked its usual bite. "It's not pity," Ethan replied firmly. "It's respect." Mia blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected that. She didn't know what to say. Ethan took a step back, sensing her discomfort. "I'll leave you alone. Just think about it." He turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Mia stood there, the bracelet still in her hand, her emotions a tangled mess. She didn't want to trust him, didn't want to believe he might actually care. But the sincerity in his voice was hard to ignore. Ethan returned to the living room, sinking into the couch with a weary sigh. He stared out at the city, his thoughts swirling. He hadn't planned on buying the bracelet. He had seen it in a shop window on his way back from a meeting earlier in the day, and something about it had reminded him of Mia. He didn't know why he cared so much. She was a stranger, an obligation born from a foolish bet. And yet, she felt like so much more than that. She challenged him, made him see parts of himself he had long ignored. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration gnawing at him. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. But Mia had a way of making everything feel messy, raw and real. Later that night, Mia sat on the edge of the bed, the bracelet resting in her palm. She hadn't worn jewelry in years. It felt strange to hold something so delicate, so full of meaning. She clasped it around her wrist, the cool metal brushing against her skin. It felt foreign and familiar all at once. She stared at it for a long time, her mind drifting to Ethan. Maybe he wasn't the shallow, self-absorbed man she had assumed. Maybe there was more to him than she wanted to admit. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she pushed it away. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not yet. The morning broke softly, the sky painted in hues of grey and pale blue. Ethan found himself awake before dawn, standing on the balcony with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The chill of the early air crept under his sweater, but he didn't move, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Last night had been different. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he gave Mia the bracelet, but the flicker of emotion in her eyes had stirred something unfamiliar in him. For the first time in a long time, he felt uncertain, vulnerable, even. Ethan was not a man who doubted himself. His confidence was the foundation of his success, a trait that had carried him through the chaos of building an empire. But Mia was chipping away at that certainty, exposing cracks he hadn't realized were there. He shook his head, taking a sip of his coffee. He didn't like feeling this way, off balance, as though he were standing on unfamiliar ground. And yet, he couldn't deny the strange pull he felt toward her. In her room, Mia sat cross-legged on the bed, the bracelet still clasped around her wrist. She hadn't taken it off since last night, though she hated to admit how much it meant to her. It wasn't just the gesture, it was the thought behind it, the way Ethan had looked at her, as if he truly saw her. She hated that it made her chest tighten, hated that it made her question the wall she had so carefully built around herself. Trust was dangerous. She knew that better than anyone. And yet, for the first time in years, she found herself wondering what it might feel like to let someone in. No, she told herself firmly. This was temporary. A deal, nothing more. Whatever kindness Ethan was showing, It didn't change the nature of their arrangement. She couldn't afford to forget that. Ethan was still on the balcony when Mia emerged from her room. She hesitated in the hallway, watching him through the glass door. He looked different like this, unguarded, his usual polished demeanor softened by the early hour. Steeling herself, Mia stepped outside. The crisp air bit at her skin, but she ignored it, crossing her arms as she leaned against the railing. Ethan glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face before he masked it with a small smile. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but cautious. Mia nodded, her gaze fixed on the city below. "Morning." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the waking city filling the space between them. Finally, Ethan broke the quiet. "Couldn't sleep?" Mia shrugged. "I guess. Your place is quiet." Ethan chuckled softly. "Too quiet." "Maybe," she admitted. "I'm not used to it." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I guess I take it for granted. The quiet, the space. I don't think about what it would be like to not have it." Mia turned to him, her green eyes sharp. "No, you don't." Her words weren't accusatory, but they carried a weight that made Ethan shift uncomfortably. He met her gaze, his own filled with a mix of guilt and curiosity. "What was it like?" he asked softly. "Before all of this?" Mia hesitated, the question catching her off guard. She looked away, her fingers brushing against the bracelet. It was different, hard, but it wasn't always bad. Ethan waited, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. But Mia didn't continue, her jaw tightening as she folded her arms more tightly across her chest. "Sorry," Ethan said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's fine," Mia replied, her tone flat. "I just don't like talking about it." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't hide the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He wanted to understand her, to bridge the chasm between them. But he knew better than to push. Later that day, Ethan found Mia sitting by the piano again. She wasn't playing, just tracing the edges of the keys with her fingertips. He hesitated in the doorway, watching her for a moment before stepping inside. "You know," he began, "there's a charity gala tonight. I wasn't planning on going, but if you wanted to, I thought it might be good for us to be seen together, for the whole arrangement." Mia turned to him, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. "A gala? Isn't that a little fancy for someone like me?" Ethan frowned, stepping closer. "You're not someone like you. You're my fiancé, remember? That's what they'll see." She gave him a skeptical look. "You really think I'll fit in at one of your fancy parties?" "You'll fit in just fine," Ethan said firmly. "Besides, it's not about fitting in. It's about being yourself." Mia studied him, her expression unreadable. Finally she sighed, standing and crossing her arms. "Fine, but if anyone gives me a reason to regret this, I'm leaving." Ethan smiled, relief washing over him. "Deal." The hours leading up to the gala were a whirlwind. Ethan had a stylist brought in to help Mia prepare, but she was reluctant, eyeing the racks of designer dresses with suspicion. "Do people actually wear this stuff?" she muttered, holding up a gown adorned with intricate beading. Ethan chuckled from across the room. "They do, and you'll look amazing." She rolled her eyes but eventually relented, allowing the stylist to work her magic. By the time she was ready, Ethan was waiting in the living room, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo. When Mia stepped out, he froze, his breath catching. She wore a deep emerald gown that hugged her figure without being ostentatious. Her hair, usually tied back, was styled in soft waves that framed her face. But it wasn't the dress or the hair that struck Ethan. It was the way she carried herself. Despite her obvious discomfort, there was a quiet confidence in her posture, a strength that made her impossible to ignore. "Well," she asked, her voice tinged with sarcasm, "do I pass the test?" Ethan smiled, his gaze soft. "You look incredible." Mia's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, fidgeting with the bracelet on her wrist. "Let's just get this over with." Ethan offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. As they left the penthouse, neither of them could shake the feeling that the night ahead would be anything but ordinary. The car ride to the gala was steeped in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Mia stared out the window, her fingers nervously tracing the charm on the bracelet Ethan had given her. The city lights blurred past, but her mind was elsewhere, caught in a web of apprehension. She had agreed to this for one reason: survival. The deal was straightforward: pretend, endure, and walk away with the means to reclaim her life. But as the car wove through the bustling streets toward the grand venue, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a world where she didn't belong. Ethan, seated beside her, stole occasional glances in her direction. She looked stunning, the emerald gown complementing her fiery green eyes. But her posture, rigid, guarded, spoke volumes. He wanted to say something, to ease the tension, but the words felt inadequate. Finally, he broke the silence. "You don't have to do this, you know. If you're uncomfortable—" Mia cut him off, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'm fine." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Just remember, you're not alone in this." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. The lump in her throat was too thick. The gala was a dazzling spectacle, held in one of the city's most opulent hotels. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the ballroom, their light reflecting off the polished marble floors. Guests dressed in gowns and tuxedos mingled, their laughter and conversation filling the air. As Ethan and Mia entered, the room seemed to pause. Heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire, and all eyes fell on the striking couple at the door. Mia felt the weight of their gazes immediately. She gripped Ethan's arm tighter, her nails digging into his sleeve. He leaned in slightly, his voice low and reassuring. "Just breathe. You've got this." She nodded, forcing herself to exhale as they descended the grand staircase. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she kept her chin up, refusing to let them see her unease. At the bottom of the stairs, Lucas Thorne appeared, his ever-present smirk firmly in place. "Campbell," he drawled, his eyes flickering to Mia. "And who is this vision?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he managed a polite smile. "Lucas, this is Mia, my fiancée." Lucas arched an eyebrow, his gaze lingering on Mia a moment too long. "Fiancée, huh? Well, Ethan, I have to say, you've outdone yourself. She's lovely." Mia felt a pang of discomfort under Lucas's scrutiny, but she met his gaze unflinchingly. "Charmed," she said coolly, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. Lucas chuckled, clearly amused. "Oh, I like her. You've got spirit, Mia." Ethan's hand subtly shifted to rest on the small of her back, a gesture that was equal parts protective and grounding. "We'll catch up later, Lucas," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As they moved deeper into the crowd, Mia leaned closer to Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. "Friend of yours?" "Unfortunately," Ethan muttered. "Don't let him get to you. He's complicated." Mia didn't reply, but her unease lingered. Lucas's words had felt less like a compliment and more like a test, one she wasn't sure she'd passed. Ethan guided Mia through the room, introducing her to various guests: business tycoons, philanthropists, socialites. She offered polite smiles, exchanged pleasantries, and nodded at the appropriate moments, but every interaction felt like a performance. The guests were kind enough on the surface, but Mia could feel their judgment in the way their eyes lingered too long, their questions veiled in condescension. "How did you two meet?" one woman asked, her smile saccharine and insincere. "At a charity event," Ethan lied smoothly, his hand resting lightly on Mia's shoulder. Mia was volunteering. It was love at first sight. Mia barely managed to keep her expression neutral, though the lie grated on her. She forced a smile, playing her part. Ethan has a way of making an impression. The woman's laugh was light and tinkling, but her eyes betrayed her doubt. Well, you're a lucky woman. Luck had nothing to do with it, Mia replied, her voice sharper than she intended. I don't rely on luck. The woman blinked, clearly taken aback, but Ethan stepped in smoothly, guiding the conversation elsewhere. As they walked away, he glanced at Mia, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. You handled that well, he murmured. Mia shot him a look. I don't need your approval. Ethan chuckled, but he didn't press further. As the evening wore on, Mia found herself stepping away from the crowd. She wandered toward the edge of the ballroom, where a grand balcony overlooked the city. The cool night air was a welcome reprieve from the stifling atmosphere inside. She leaned against the railing, her eyes scanning the skyline. The city stretched out before her, a glittering sea of lights that felt both beautiful and distant. You disappeared. Ethan's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him stepping onto the balcony, a glass of champagne in hand. I needed some air, she replied, turning back to the view. Ethan joined her, leaning against the railing beside her. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the city filling the space between them. You're doing great in there, he said eventually. Better than I expected. Mia smirked. Gee, thanks. I mean it, Ethan said, his tone softening. You're holding your own. I know this isn't easy. Mia glanced at him, her expression guarded. Why do you care? Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to his glass. Because I dragged you into this. The least I can do is make sure you're okay. Mia studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity. But all she saw was honesty, raw and unguarded. It unnerved her. I'm fine, she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. Ethan didn't press, but he didn't look away, his eyes lingering on her as if trying to understand her better. You're stronger than you think, Mia, he said quietly. And you don't need anyone in there to tell you that. Mia's breath caught, the sincerity in his words hitting her harder than she expected. She looked away, her fingers brushing against the bracelet on her wrist. The sound of laughter and music drifted from the ballroom, a reminder of the world they had temporarily left behind. But for a moment, standing there under the night sky, it felt as though they were the only two people in the world. The balcony air grew colder as the evening deepened, but neither Ethan nor Mia moved to rejoin the gala. The city below, with its sparkling lights and distant hum, seemed to hold them in its quiet embrace, offering a reprieve from the crowd inside. Mia tightened her grip on the railing, her fingers brushing against the smooth metal. The weight of the evening pressed down on her. Lucas's veiled mockery, the judgmental glances from strangers, the exhausting performance of pretending she belonged. She had told herself she could endure it, but cracks were starting to form. You're quiet, Ethan said, breaking the stillness. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as though he didn't want to intrude on her thoughts. Mia turned to him, her green eyes sharp but weary. Is that surprising? Not much to say to people like them. Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing. People like them? She let out a humorless laugh, the sound cutting through the quiet. You know exactly what I mean. Rich, polished, pretending to care while they look down on everyone who doesn't fit their perfect little mold. People like you. Her words were a dagger, but Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he met her gaze, his expression steady. Is that what you think of me? Mia hesitated, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his tone. She wanted to say yes, to hold on to the anger that had kept her afloat for so long, but something in Ethan's eyes stopped her. I don't know, she admitted, her voice quieter now. Maybe you're different, but it's hard to tell when you're surrounded by all of this. Ethan exhaled, turning his gaze to the skyline. You're right. I've been surrounded by this world for so long, I forget how it looks from the outside. But I didn't always have it. Mia raised an eyebrow, skepticism flickering across her face. Really? You weren't born with a silver spoon in your mouth? Ethan chuckled, though the sound was tinged with bitterness. Not exactly. My dad worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. My mom, she was the dreamer, always telling me I could be more than the life we had. When she got sick, I promised her I'd make something of myself, that I'd build a life she could have been proud of. Mia blinked, the unexpected confession catching her off guard. What happened to her? She passed before I made it, Ethan said, his voice tightening. Cancer. We couldn't afford the treatment she needed. For a moment, Mia didn't know what to say. The anger she had clung to began to waver, replaced by a flicker of understanding. I'm sorry, she said softly, her hand brushing against the bracelet he had given her. I didn't know. Ethan turned to her, his gaze steady. I'm not telling you this for pity. I want you to know that I get it. The struggle, the feeling that the world's stacked against you. I haven't forgotten. Mia looked away, the city lights blurring as her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. It doesn't change anything. You're still here, surrounded by everything I've spent my life fighting against. But I'm here with you, Ethan said, his voice firm but gentle. And I'm trying. Isn't that worth something? The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mia turned back to him, her defenses cracking under the weight of his sincerity. She searched his face for any trace of insincerity, but found none. It's not easy for me to trust people, she said finally, her voice trembling. Every time I have, it's come back to haunt me. Ethan nodded, his gaze unwavering. I'm not asking you to trust me right away, but give me a chance to prove I'm not like the others. Mia exhaled, her shoulders slumping as the tension drained from her body. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that Ethan's intentions might be genuine. All right, she said quietly, but don't make me regret it. Ethan smiled, a small, hopeful curve of his lips. I won't. As they re-entered the ballroom, the music had shifted to a slow, melodic waltz. Couples swayed under the golden glow of the chandeliers, their movements fluid and graceful. Ethan held out a hand to Mia, his smile soft. Dance with me. Mia hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. I'm not exactly waltz material. You'll be fine, Ethan said, his voice laced with gentle encouragement. Just follow my lead. Reluctantly, she placed her hand in his, letting him guide her to the center of the room. As they began to move, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. Mia's initial stiffness gave way to tentative ease as Ethan led her through the steps, his hand firm yet reassuring on her back. You're a natural, he said, his tone teasing but kind. Don't push it, Mia replied, though the faintest smile tugged at her lips. They danced in silence for a moment, their movements becoming more synchronized. For the first time that evening, Mia felt the weight of the judgmental stares lift. In Ethan's arms, she wasn't an outsider. She was simply Mia. As the song ended, applause rippled through the room, but neither Ethan nor Mia seemed to notice. They stood there, still close, their breaths mingling in the space between them. Thank you, Mia said softly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the crowd. For what? Ethan asked, his brow furrowing. For not giving up on me, she said, her green eyes glistening. Ethan smiled, his hand brushing against hers. I think we're just getting started. Later that night, as they left the gala and drove through the quiet streets, Mia stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. You know, the bet doesn't matter anymore. Mia turned to him, surprise flickering across her face. What do you mean? I mean, I don't care about the deal, Ethan said firmly. This, whatever we're building, it's real to me, and I want to see where it goes. Mia's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay guarded. We'll see, she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the faintest hint of a smile. Ethan smiled too, his hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. "We will." And as the city lights blurred into the distance, they both allowed themselves to believe, if only for a moment, that their paths might lead to something extraordinary. This conclusion ties together the emotional journey of both characters, showing growth, vulnerability, and the promise of a future built on mutual understanding and respect. It leaves the story open-ended, allowing the audience to imagine what comes next while providing a satisfying sense of closure. As the city lights faded into the distance, their journey together was only beginning, a story of unexpected connections, personal growth, and the courage to embrace a second chance. What started as a reckless gamble became something far more meaningful, proving that even in the most unlikely circumstances, people can surprise us, and we can surprise ourselves. If you enjoyed this story of transformation and resilience, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful tale. Your support means the world and helps bring stories like this to life. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.